Welcome to Sleeping Radio. Tonight, I would like to take your hand gently and lead you into a quiet corner of history. We are going back in time to a warm Japanese night in a city that still sleeps in peace. A city called Hiroshima. The air is slightly humid, and the old wooden houses creak softly under the touch of a warm breeze. Families finish their dinners while children drift into sleep on thin straw mats. The streets are calm and the sky is clear, and the sound of distant footsteps fades into the stillness. No one knows that this quiet will be the last thing thousands of people ever hear. Far away above the ocean, an American bomber is already in the sky. Its metal body carries a new kind of weapon that no human being has seen used before. But down on the ground, life is still simple and ordinary. People are thinking about work, school, and food, not about the end of the world. In the early hours of the morning on the 6th of August in the year 1945, a man named Tsutomu Yamaguchi wakes up in Hiroshima. He is an engineer in his 30s working for the Mitsubishi company designing oil tankers. He has spent 3 months in this city on a work assignment, and now he is preparing to go back home. His home city is Nagasaki, where his wife and little son are waiting. He is tired but hopeful, and his mind is full of small everyday thoughts. The train schedule, the feeling of sitting again with his family, the comfort of resting after hard days of work. He folds his papers carefully into a simple leather file and checks them with quiet care. In his pocket, he places his return ticket as if it were a promise that he will go back home. The city around him wakes slowly as the morning grows brighter. Bicycles rattle across the streets, and students walk toward their schools with soft footsteps. Women gather around wells and taps and speak in low voices. The smell of freshly cooked rice drifts through the narrow wooden alleyways. Nothing seems strange, and nothing suggests that this day will be different from any other summer morning. If there is a warning, it is too quiet for anyone to hear. Above the city, the sky is wide and open, and the blue is clear. High up, a tiny white point appears and moves slowly across that blue. It is only an airplane to anyone who looks up for a moment. Bombers have flown over Japan many times before, and people have grown used to the idea of danger far above their heads. Normally, the sirens would sound and people would run to shelters in fear. On this morning, the sirens remain silent, and the city is left in its fragile peace. Tsutomu walks toward the shipyard, adjusting his cloth cap against the growing sun. He moves with the steady steps of a man who believes he knows how his day will end. He glances up at the sky for a second to judge the time from the height of the sun. As he does, he notices that small white shape moving slowly overhead. Then the world changes in a single breath. It does not change with thunder at first, but with light. Not the soft gold of morning light, and not the gentle glow of a lamp. It is a white so pure and violent that it does not seem like light at all. For a fraction of a second, everything becomes this white world. There is no street, no body, no house, only a blinding, silent brightness. Then the air itself seems to explode. A shock wave tears through the city and through every living thing within it. Windows shatter inward and walls are ripped apart. Trees, roofs, people, animals, and stones are thrown as if an invisible giant hand has swept across the ground. Tsutomu feels his body lifted and hurled to the earth. Heat claws at his skin and bites into his face and arm. The sky darkens as dust and ash and fragments of the broken city rush upward. The clear blue morning disappears behind a rising curtain of smoke. It is 8:15 in the morning when the bomb explodes. In less than a heartbeat, a city of more than 100,000 souls begins to melt into fire and shadow. Tsutomu is about 3 kilometers from the center of the blast, close enough for the heat to melt glass and metal, close enough to die like so many others. Yet somehow he does not die. His right eardrum ruptures and blood and sound vanish on that side of his head. The skin on the side of his face and along his arm burns and blisters. His clothes tear and blacken under the force of the heat. For some time he lies on the ground, stunned, as if the world itself has been erased. When he finally forces his eyes open, the bright morning is gone. Above him hangs a heavy, swirling mass of black and dirty grey. The sun is hidden, and the air is full of falling ash and glowing fragments. Buildings around him are broken and twisted. Flames begin to rise from many places at once, as if the entire city has caught fire in a single breath. For a moment, there are no human sounds, only a deep, crushing silence, like the pause after a scream that has not yet reached the ears. Then another sound begins to grow in the distance. A low, endless moaning that is not from one person but from thousands of damaged throats. People stumble out from under collapsed roofs and broken beams. Their bodies are burned and their clothes have melted into their skin. Some faces have lost their features in the heat and look like smooth masks. Others are covered in ash and blood so that their eyes seem to float in grey mud. Tsutomu tries to stand and his body protests with sharp pain. But somewhere deep inside, a small, stubborn instinct pushes him to move. He leans on a broken, still hot stone and breathes shallowly through the thick, smoky air. The smell around him is a mixture of burning wood, metal, and something no one forgets once they know it: burned human flesh. Above the city, the mushroom-shaped cloud rises slowly higher. It will later become a symbol of fear for the entire world, but now it is simply a growing wound in the sky. All Tsutomu knows in this moment is that the streets he walked just minutes ago are gone. The city that surrounded him has turned into a field of fire and rubble. He does not know that this was the first atomic bomb ever used in war. He does not know that the whole planet will one day write the name Hiroshima into its memory. He only knows that somewhere far from here, his wife Hisako and his little son Katsu are alive, and he knows that he must try to reach them. Around him, the ruins begin to move, as if the broken stones themselves are breathing. Survivors drag their bodies forward, calling the names of family members. Over and over he hears the same cracked word: water, water. A simple request in a place where almost everything has been taken away. Tsutomu finds 2 of his colleagues from the company amid the wreckage. One is burned so badly that his face is almost impossible to recognize. The other walks unsteadily, with eyes half closed, as if he is trapped between sleep and waking. Together they begin to move through what is left of the streets. They follow the direction that was once the main road of the city. Now it is only a path between broken walls and piles of ash and glass. The asphalt under their feet is soft and sticky from the heat. Grey ash falls from the sky like a slow, poisonous snow and clings to their hair and skin. After what feels like hours but is only a handful of minutes, they find a shallow trench in the earth behind the remains of a factory. The building has partly survived and offers a small corner of shelter. They sit there, breathing harshly in the hot, heavy air. The smell around them is thick with burned iron, burned wood, and the strange metallic taste of water that has boiled and vanished. Tsutomu takes out a small piece of cloth that was once part of his shirt or bag. He also finds a tiny bottle with a little water that he has somehow kept through the blast. His hands shake as he weights the cloth and gently wipes his burns. The pain is sharp and bright, but he moves slowly and carefully. He is not thinking about war or enemies or history in this moment. He is thinking only about staying alive long enough to go home. Home means Hisako, the quiet strength of her presence. Home means little Kotsu and the sound of his small feet and soft voice. Outside the trench, the wounded city continues to groan. People wander without clear direction, calling and sobbing and sometimes falling silent where they stand. Some have lost their sight and hold out their hands in front of them like sleepwalkers. Some have lost their voices and their mouths open and close without sound. The day crawls forward under a sky that no longer looks like a sky. The heat remains heavy and cruel, pressing down on every living thing that is left. At noon, the sun is only a faint glow behind the curtain of smoke. The light that reaches the ground is weak and strange, as if it has been wounded too. By afternoon, Tsutomu understands that if he stays where he is, he will die among the ruins. He does not fully know what has happened to Hiroshima. He only knows that he must leave before night falls. The instinct to move away from this broken place is as strong as the instinct to breathe. Slowly and painfully he stands and begins to walk again. Each step is a small decision to continue living. The route out of the city is filled with scenes that look like paintings of a quiet hell. Trees stand black and leafless. Small rivers bubble and steam as if they have been boiled. Bridges are twisted and bent like soft wire. Bodies lie across the ground, some still, some moving with small, weak gestures. Every few steps, the same thin word reaches his ears again. Water, water, a voice cracked by thirst and shock. On the outskirts of the devastated area, a farmer sees the burned engineer struggling along the road. The man brings him a small cup of water held in rough hands. For Tsutomu, this single cup tastes richer than any feast he has ever known. He bows in gratitude with a voice that is dry and scraped thin. Then he continues on his way, step by slow step. Every meter of distance from the burning city feels like leaving a piece of himself behind. When night finally comes, the sky over Hiroshima glows with a dull red light. The city burns like a silent volcano at the edge of the world. Tsutomu sits on a rock, his body shaking with exhaustion. He looks back toward the fire and smoke and knows that he has survived something that should have ended his life. He does not yet know that his journey through the flames is only half finished. Far away in another city, Nagasaki still sleeps under an ordinary sky. When night finally settled fully over the land, the sky above Hiroshima still glowed faintly red. The city burned behind Tsutomu like a distant silent volcano at the edge of the world. His body shook with exhaustion as he sat on the cold rock by the roadside. Yet somewhere beneath the fear and pain, a small, quiet thought repeated itself: go home. At first light, he stood again and began to walk toward a small country station. The ground was rough under his feet, and every step felt heavier than the one before. Along the way, he met other survivors, moving like shadows. Some walked alone, and some supported each other with arms around burned shoulders. Faces were wrapped in dirty cloth, and eyes stared forward without expression. The world behind them was fire, so the only direction left was away. At last he reached a little station that had escaped complete destruction. It was damaged and crowded, but still connected to the rails that led out of the ruined city. Inside the waiting area, people sat on the floor, leaning against broken walls. Soldiers, workers, mothers with children, all carried the same thin look of shock. No one knew exactly what had happened to Hiroshima. Some whispered about a new bomb, while others murmured that the end of the world had begun. When a train finally arrived, it moved slowly and heavily. It carried the wounded, the frightened, and the silent. and seemed to breathe like a tired animal. Tsutomu climbed aboard, gripping the hot metal handle with bandaged hands. He found a corner on the floor and lowered himself carefully against the wall. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, his mind replayed the same broken pictures: the impossible light, the burning sky, the bodies without voices. Outside the windows the countryside flowed past in green and brown. Villages still stood untouched, and fields still lay under the sun as if nothing had changed. For those on the train, everything had changed forever. But the wider world was only beginning to understand that a new kind of weapon now existed. Hours later, the train began to slow as it approached Nagasaki. The smell of the sea drifted in through the small open windows, carrying salt and a faint coolness. To Tsutomu, that familiar scent felt like a hand laid gently on his shoulder. It reminded him that somewhere beyond pain there was still such a thing as home. When he stepped down onto the platform, the city seemed whole and alive. Buildings stood straight, trams rattled, and people walked with the easy movements of ordinary days. He made his way through the streets to his quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city. Hills rose green around the houses, and the air felt heavier but calm. At the door of his modest home, he paused for a heartbeat. Then he slid it open and stepped inside with the slow, careful steps of a man returning from another world. His wife Hisoko looked up, and her eyes widened in shock. The man before her was burned and wrapped in cloth, his hair singed and his voice thin, yet beneath the wounds she recognized the way he moved and breathed. It was the same gentle presence that had left months before to work in Hiroshima. She helped him sit and brought him water with steady hands. The reunion was filled not with many words, but with quiet gratitude that he had somehow come back. Their small son Katsu approached shyly from the corner of the room. He looked at the bandages with wide, uncertain eyes and reached out to touch his father's hand. Tsutomu stroked the child's hair softly in return. In that simple gesture he felt both apology and promise. Apology for all he could not protect, and promise to keep living. That night, as he lay on a thin mattress, sleep would not settle easily. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw again the white flash and the city dissolving into fire. There was a new weight in his chest that went beyond his injuries. It was the heavy knowledge that he had seen something words could not truly hold. The next day, a local doctor came to examine him. He unwrapped the bandages gently and looked at the burns with a practiced but sorrowful gaze. He listened to Tsutomu's account of the blast, the light, the heat, and the ruins. When the story ended, there was a quiet pause in the small room. Then the doctor spoke in a low, serious tone. He said that most people who had been closer to the center than Tsutomu had not survived at all. He told him to be grateful for the thin line that had separated him from death. Tsutomu nodded slowly but did not answer, because gratitude and grief were tangled together inside him. Over the next 2 days he rested, ate small bowls of rice, and tried to regain some strength. The pain eased a little, but the memory did not. His son sometimes sat beside him and traced the edges of the bandages with small fingers. Tsutomu would smile faintly and pat his head to reassure them both. Outside Nagasaki, life went on, at least on the surface. Shops opened, radios reported confusing news of the war, and trams carried people through streets that still stood. But inside their small home, another decision was forming. Despite his injuries, Tsutomu felt he needed to return to the Mitsubishi office in Nagasaki. He wanted to report what had happened in Hiroshima. He believed that if people understood the power of this new weapon, they might prepare in some way. On the 8th of August, he wrapped his burns as best he could. Then he dressed slowly and set out toward the company building. Walking hurt, but he moved with calm determination. The familiar streets looked almost unreal after what his eyes had seen only days before. At the office, his colleagues greeted him with surprise and concern. His bandages and tired eyes told part of the story before his voice did. They gathered around as he described the blinding light and the instant destruction. He spoke of buildings turned to dust and bodies burned where they stood. Some listened with wide, troubled eyes and said nothing. Others shifted uneasily and tried to push the idea aside as something too strange to be fully believed. One man even laughed weakly, trying to protect himself with doubt. He said that a single bomb could never wipe out an entire city, that such a thing was impossible. Tsutomu did not argue or raise his voice. He simply said quietly that he had seen it with his own eyes and could not forget it. The room fell into a thoughtful silence for a moment. But then work resumed and routine tried to cover the chill that his words had brought. That evening he went back home more exhausted than before. He sat near the window and looked out at Nagasaki under the soft light of the moon. He saw people walking along the streets and heard children laughing at a distance. Lanterns swayed gently above the river, and the water reflected the small golden lights. Everything looked peaceful and familiar, and that was what made it feel so fragile. He knew now how easily such a scene could vanish in a single moment. He told Hisoko that something might be coming and that they should be ready in their hearts. She did not completely understand what he meant, but she trusted the shadow in his gaze. Outside, the night grew very still. It felt as if the world itself were holding its breath before speaking again. The next morning arrived with clear skies and warm air. It was the 9th of August, another summer day that did not yet know its own place in history. Nagasaki slowly woke to the sound of everyday life. People dressed for work, doors opened, and the city resumed its regular rhythm. In the small house on the edge of the city, Tsutomu rose early once more. His burns still hurt, and his body was weak, but he chose again to follow his routine. He stood before the little mirror and saw his face wrapped in white. His arm was still bound in cloth, but his eyes looked back at him with quiet resolve. His son looked up at him with sleepy curiosity and asked a tender question. He wanted to know if the sun itself had been burned. Tsutomu managed a faint smile and answered gently that the sun was still there. He said it had only come too close to them on that terrible day. Then he stepped out of the house, leaning on his walking stick. The road to the office led over a small bridge above a calm, flowing river. Trees lined the banks and their leaves moved softly in the morning breeze. The sound of the water below was low and soothing. For a brief time, the world seemed kind again. The memory of Hiroshima felt like a nightmare that might finally begin to fade. Around 11 in the morning, he stood once more in the Mitsubishi office. His manager and colleagues gathered while he continued describing what had happened in Hiroshima. He told them about the light that was not like the sun and not like fire. He spoke of a brightness that erased everything it touched and left only ash behind. He quietly confessed that he had believed himself dead in that moment. He had woken in the ruins convinced that he had seen the end of the world. But before he could finish his final sentence, the air around them changed. It was sudden and strangely familiar. Outside, high above Nagasaki, another bomber had reached its target. The second atomic bomb was falling through the sky toward the unsuspecting city. At 11 minutes past 11, the heavens split open again. A new sun blossomed over Nagasaki, this time bright and merciless. Tsutomu saw the flash and recognized it instantly with a cold certainty. The same white universe, the same impossible glare, had returned. He shouted for everyone to lie down, but his warning was swallowed by the blast. In the same instant, windows burst inward, and walls began to crumble. The building shook as if some giant hand had struck it. Glass, wood, dust, and flame filled the air in a furious storm. Once again, Tsutomu was thrown to the floor and covered in debris. The sound pounded through his body, and the heat pressed against his skin. When the shaking finally died away, he opened his eyes slowly. The room was choked with dust, and people were crying out in pain and confusion. Outside, Nagasaki was beginning to burn, just as Hiroshima had burned. Smoke rose and spread, and the sky darkened with a terrible familiarity. Tsutomu struggled to his feet, covered from head to toe in grey powder. Every movement hurt, but he forced himself toward the shattered doorway. He stepped into a world that looked like a reflection of his recent nightmare. Buildings were torn open, the streets were filled with rubble, and far in the distance a new mushroom cloud climbed into the sky. For a moment he felt as though time itself had broken and was repeating the same day. 3 days apart, 2 cities, one kind of ending. People ran without direction, their voices thin and shocked. The sky above them turned the same bruised mixture of black, brown, and angry red. But inside Tsutomu, something had changed between the first blast and the second. The fear that had once threatened to consume him now settled into a deep, strange calm. Instead of panicking, he moved with slow, steady steps. He knew now that he had to find his way home again, no matter how the world looked. He walked for hours through streets that no longer felt like streets. Around him, the city of Nagasaki was dissolving into smoke and broken stone. By the time he reached his neighborhood, his legs were trembling. Yet he kept going until he saw the outline of his own small house. The building was damaged, but still standing. Windows had shattered and parts of the roof had broken, but the walls held. He opened the door with shaking hands and called out. His voice was rough, but it carried through the small rooms. Hisako and Katsu were inside, frightened but alive. They had escaped with cuts and bruises, but no serious injuries. Hisako looked at him with eyes that held both terror and relief. She asked, in a trembling voice, whether this was what had happened in Hiroshima too. He answered softly that it was exactly the same. Another sun, another city, the same kind of silence after the roar. They sat together on the floor while the world outside burned again. This time, the feeling in his chest was not only horror but also a quiet, heavy clarity. He had survived 2 atomic blasts in 3 days. The chance of that happening was so small that it felt almost like a message. He did not know yet what that message was or to whom it should be delivered. But a thought began to form gently inside him. Maybe I am meant to tell this story. That night, as he watched the strange glow above Nagasaki, he did not make promises or grand decisions. He simply breathed slowly and thanked silently for the gift of another day. He sensed that his survival was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a much longer path, a path where memory itself would become his work. Days passed slowly after the bombing of Nagasaki. The city lay under a blanket of smoke and dust, and the streets were filled with quiet, broken shapes. Food became scarce, and clean water was difficult to find. The air tasted of metal and ash, and every breath reminded people of what had happened. A strange sickness began to appear among the survivors of both cities. Fevers rose suddenly without warning, and bodies weakened even when the burns had healed. Hair fell out in handfuls and mouths filled with sores. Many bled without visible wounds, as if something invisible had entered their blood. No one yet understood the word radiation. The survivors only knew that something silent and deadly remained inside them. Tsutomu walked through the ruins each morning with careful steps. His body still hurt, and his burns healed slowly, but he continued to move forward. He searched for meaning among the broken stones and empty streets. Each day he tried to understand why he had been spared when so many had not. At night he returned home and listened to the soft breathing of his son. The gentle sound was a reminder that life was still possible. Sometimes he stepped outside to look at the sky. The clouds seemed closer now, and the stars looked sharper and more fragile than before. One quiet evening he spoke softly to his Oko. He told her he had seen 2 cities burn in a single week and feared that few would believe him. She looked at him with tired but steady eyes. She told him it did not matter who believed him as long as he continued to live. Her simple words planted something calm within him. It was like the first seed growing in a field of ash. Weeks turned into months as Japan struggled to recover. News spread across the country and eventually across the world. The war came to its end on paper, but peace did not arrive immediately for the survivors. The memories remained alive in every ruined street and every empty place where a home once stood. Slowly, the people of Nagasaki began to rebuild their city. They moved stones aside, repaired broken walls, and tried to create order from destruction. Fishermen returned to the water, and mothers lined up for food. Children played in the ruins and turned shards of glass and broken tiles into small treasures. One day, Tsutomu was called by local officials. They were beginning to collect the stories of those who had lived through the catastrophe. He sat in a small room across from a clerk who held a notebook. The man asked him where he had been on the 9th of August. Tsutomu answered calmly that he had been in the same place he had been on the 6th, 3 kilometers from the center of an atomic blast in 2 different cities. The clerk froze for a moment with his pen above the page. Then he looked up in disbelief, trying to understand the impossible truth before him. He repeated the question to make sure he had heard correctly. Tsutomu nodded once and quietly confirmed that he had survived both bombs. A long silence followed in the small office. Then the clerk began to write slowly, as if the story itself was heavier than the paper could hold. When Tsutomu stepped outside after the interview, something inside him felt different. His experience no longer belonged only to him. He now understood that he carried a piece of history that needed to be remembered. He felt that staying silent would be a different kind of death. From that day on, he began to speak more openly. He talked to friends, to neighbors, and to anyone who asked. Each time he told the story, his voice grew softer but also steadier. Sharing the memory seemed to both tire him and strengthen him at the same time. Years passed as Japan rebuilt itself into a new shape. Factories began humming again, and trains filled the countryside with movement and sound. Neon lights slowly returned to city streets, and signs of a new era began to appear. But beneath the progress, the memories of the bomb stayed alive. Tsutomu found work as a designer in a small company near the sea. He sat at his desk, drawing the shapes of ships that would float safely on the water. In the mornings, he walked to work with his old cloth bag. In the evenings, he returned home to simple meals and quiet moments with his family. It was the same border he had crossed twice between life and death. A thin space where everything could end in a single breath. He remembered the light that swallowed the world. He remembered the silence that followed. But he also remembered seeing the first thin blades of grass growing in the ashes. To him, those tiny green shoots were the greatest miracle. They proved that life did not surrender easily, even after being struck by fire. Among his colleagues, he became known as the double survivor, the quiet man who had lived through 2 atomic blasts. but he never felt comfortable with that title. He said he did not want to be remembered only for surviving. He told a friend once that he wished to be known for what he did with the life he had been given afterward. Those words revealed the core of his spirit. In the 1960s and 70s, journalists and filmmakers began to seek out survivors' stories. They felt the world needed to hear the voices of those who had witnessed the dawn of a new kind of destruction. Tsutomu appeared in several interviews. He sat calmly under the soft glow of studio lights and spoke in his gentle voice. He told viewers that when you see a city disappear in a moment, you understand the true fragility of life. His words moved people, although he spoke them without anger. Thousands watched his interviews, and many sent letters afterward. Some thanked him for speaking, and others said they too had lived through the blasts, but remained silent for many years. One letter came from a child in Nagasaki. The child wrote that their grandfather had died in the blast, but listening to Tsutomu felt like hearing the voice of the past. For the first time in many years, Tsutomu allowed his tears to fall. It was a quiet weeping, soft and cleansing like gentle rain on parched earth. He continued to visit schools, museums, and community halls. He spoke not to accuse or to demand, but to witness and to remind. He said, "The world does not destroy itself with bombs alone. It destroys itself when it forgets the lessons those bombs carried." Over time, he became a symbol of peace. Not because he shouted or preached loudly, but because he carried his memory with calm dignity. He joined memorial walks holding a single white flower in his hand. He stood beside rivers where the ashes of the victims had once drifted away. He bowed his head in silence during ceremonies and let the stillness speak where words could not. In those moments, he seemed to hold the weight of two cities on his shoulders. When a journalist once asked him what he would change if he could go back, he answered with a faint, tired smile. He said maybe he would lift his head and close his eyes before the light came. But he also said there are events larger than any one person. He believed that we cannot stop such events once they begin. All we can do is carry their memory with us and keep walking forward. He spoke of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as if walking through a quiet temple. His tone was always soft, slow, and respectful. As he grew older, his body weakened, but his message grew stronger. People began calling him the grandfather who survived twice. Schools taught his story to new generations so the memory would not fade. Children listened with wide eyes, and teachers spoke of the fragility of peace. Tsutomu repeated the same truth in many ways, but the meaning was always the same. He said he did not want people to fear the past, but to fear repeating it. He told audiences that peace does not come from treaties alone. Peace is a daily choice, made in the way we speak, think, and treat one another. Every time he returned home from a talk, he prepared a small cup of green tea. He sat quietly while the steam rose and closed his eyes for a moment of rest. The memories still visited him, but they no longer overwhelmed him. They passed through him like shadows moving across a calm floor. He had learned that real survival was not just living through the bombs. Real survival was learning how to live with what the bombs had left behind. Even in his last years, he continued to walk slowly through the streets of Nagasaki. Sometimes strangers recognized him and bowed respectfully. He always bowed back with the same gentle courtesy. He believed that kindness was the simplest form of peace that anyone could offer. His story spread far beyond Japan as time moved forward. People around the world learned about the quiet man who had endured what few ever could. Some called him a miracle. Others called him a witness. But Tsutomu only saw himself as a man who had been given more days than he expected. He hoped that by speaking quietly and honestly, he could help others understand the true cost of war. He wished that no one else would ever see cities vanish under a rising sun. When he was very old, he walked one last time to the shoreline near his home. He stood there watching the calm water and listening to the waves. He realized he had carried two great tragedies across the decades. Yet he had also carried love, family, and the simple peace of ordinary days. He breathed in the salty air and felt a quiet acceptance settle over him. He had lived long enough to turn pain into wisdom and fear into compassion. In the final season of his life, he rested more often. Family members gathered around him, and old friends visited to share gentle conversations. He spoke little, but his presence remained steady and warm. His eyes, though tired, still held the same depth that had carried him through fire and rebuilding. When the end finally came, it arrived softly, like a curtain of night falling over a calm landscape. His passing was quiet, peaceful, and surrounded by love. The city of Nagasaki honored him as a symbol of remembrance. His story continued to be told in museums, classrooms, and quiet gatherings. People lit lanterns on the river to carry light into the dark, a tradition that symbolized both memory and hope. The lanterns floated gently away, glowing like small stars on the water. Even today, the story of Tsutomu Yamaguchi lives on. His journey reminds the world that healing begins with remembering and that peace begins with understanding. He showed that survival is not only about living through destruction. It is about carrying compassion into the days that follow and choosing kindness where anger once lived. His life stands as a reminder that even in the shadow of unimaginable fire, there can be hope, and that the softest voices are sometimes the ones that last the longest. Japan slowly stepped out of the ruins of war and began rebuilding its cities. The streets filled once again with workers and families trying to find a sense of normal life. Factories reopened and children returned to makeshift schools made of wood and metal sheets. Teachers wrote lessons on blackboards while sunlight slipped through broken windows. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Park began to take shape. Survivors and volunteers planted small trees in the soil that had once been scorched by unimaginable heat. People gathered pieces of rubble and arranged them into pathways that led to quiet corners of reflection. Each stone felt like a memory placed gently back into the world. Artists began painting scenes, not of destruction, but of light and water. They wanted to show that beauty could still rise from a place where darkness once ruled. Musicians composed soft melodies inspired by wind and rain. Their music carried the feeling of healing rather than sorrow. In literature, a new kind of writing emerged, known as atomic bomb literature. Authors focused not only on the suffering, but also on the resilience of the human spirit. One writer described a child holding his sister's hand and whispering that the daylight was still there. The simplicity of the moment became a symbol of survival. Hiroshima and Nagasaki gradually became not only cities of tragedy, but cities of teaching. Schools held commemorations each year on the anniversaries of the bombings. Children stood in silence for 1 minute at dawn. During that silence, even the wind seemed to pause, as if listening with them. Teachers explained that remembering was not to reopen pain, but to learn how to prevent its return. The past became a guide rather than a fear. Students wrote letters to the future, hoping their words would reach generations they would never meet. They wrote about peace in small, honest sentences that felt like prayers. In universities, the study of nuclear ethics became an important field. Science students were taught that knowledge without compassion could lead to catastrophe. Physics classes were sometimes taken on field trips to the Hiroshima Memorial Museum. Afterward, students wrote reflections about the power of light and responsibility. The reflections were not technical reports, but personal thoughts about humanity. The young generation began to understand that science and morality must move together. Artists of later decades continued to reinterpret the memory of the bomb through gentle symbolism. Some drew cranes flying over shining cities as a reminder of fragile peace. Poets wrote about streets that fall asleep each night, holding the names of the lost. Their verses moved softly like the breeze of an autumn evening. Even architecture in Hiroshima adopted a new meaning. Buildings were designed with curves and glass that reflected the sky instead of closing it out. It was as if the city chose to remember itself through light rather than shadows. The new skyline stood peaceful and open to the world. In daily life, modern Japan remained fast-paced but carried a quiet respect for silence. People on trains, in cafes, and on sidewalks moved with a sense of gentle awareness. This stillness felt like a memory passed from one generation to the next. It was not sorrow but a quiet understanding of how fragile peace can be. In one school in Nagasaki, a 6th grade student wrote on a classroom board. She wrote that although she had never seen the bomb, she lived in the light of those who survived it. The teacher left the sentence on the wall for the entire year. Students read it each morning and carried its meaning with them into the day. Visitors from many countries came to Hiroshima seeking to understand the past. Survivors welcomed them with warm hospitality and simple guidance. They shared tea and stories about rebuilding and forgiveness. Their words offered not accusation but clarity and humanity. Hiroshima eventually became a destination for global peace conferences. Leaders and scholars gathered to speak about nuclear disarmament. Children from across the world visited the Peace Park and folded paper cranes. Each crane carried a wish for a world that would never know such destruction again. In the evenings, the city prepared for the lantern ceremony. Thousands of glowing lanterns floated on the river with names and prayers written on their sides. From a distance, the river looked like a pathway of stars traveling slowly through time. The glow reflected on the water, creating a soft golden light. Some lanterns carried messages, such as, "Let there be peace in every sunrise." Others carried only a name whispered into the paper before being set gently on the water. People watched the lanterns drift away in deep silence. The moment felt like a conversation between the living and those who had departed. By the 1980s, Japanese culture reflected the past in new ways. Animated films focused on ordinary people during wartime rather than battle scenes. One film showed a brother and sister searching for comfort in a collapsing world. Viewers around the globe cried softly as if feeling the memory themselves. Music in the 1980s also carried echoes of remembrance. Songs spoke of longing, of gentle rain, and of the quiet return of hope. The melodies were soft and filled with emotion. They seemed to carry the voices of ancestors who still whispered through time. Technology grew rapidly, but the memory of the bombs remained woven into modern life. Video games, comics, and online stories used symbolic imagery to express the lessons of the past. A ruined city, a single surviving flower, or a barefoot child became recurring symbols. These images reminded players and readers of human fragility. Universities expanded their research into nuclear responsibility. Students studying atomic science began their training with memorial visits. They wrote essays about balancing progress with humanity. Professors reminded them that every discovery carried an ethical shadow. Japan's population learned to protect peace as a daily practice. It became a cultural habit like manners, courtesy, or caring for a garden. Parents told their children that silence could be a form of respect, and children understood that remembering was not fear but awareness. In an elementary school, a student once wrote, "We did not see the bomb, but we walk in the light of those who survived it." That simple sentence summarized an entire nation's journey, a journey from fire to wisdom and from darkness to gentle understanding. In the decades that followed the bombings, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki settled gently into the heart of Japan. It became a quiet reminder carried in the way people walked, spoke, and lived. The younger generation grew up surrounded by modern cities and technology. Yet the silence of the past lived softly in their homes and in the stories their grandparents whispered before sleep. Every year, on August 6th and 9th, schools across Japan held ceremonies of remembrance. Students gathered at sunrise and listened to the ringing of a single bell. For 1 minute, the entire school stood in perfect stillness. Even the birds seemed to pause in mid-flight, as if honoring the moment. Teachers explained that the purpose of memory was not fear. Its purpose was to teach compassion and to show how precious peace truly is. Children were encouraged to draw pictures of the world they wished to see. Their drawings showed gardens full of flowers and streets, without soldiers standing guard. Some children wrote small poems saying the sky is one sky, so let us not divide it with fire. Others wrote that the wind does not know enemies and carries only the scent of the earth. Schools invited students from other countries to visit Hiroshima as part of a global exchange. The goal was to allow young people to learn about peace through experience, not just books. In these gatherings, a young girl once read from Takashi's old diary. Her voice trembled gently as she recited the line he had written long ago. She read that fear leaves only when we give others safety. Then she lifted her head and said softly that her generation would try to be the generation of safety. The room responded with warm, quiet applause. It was not loud or celebratory, but comforting and sincere. In the Hiroshima Peace Museum, some of Takashi's belongings were displayed. His wooden cane lay beside his yellow notebook, and a photograph of him smiling near the dome. Visitors from around the world stopped to look at that picture. They felt a mix of sorrow and calm strength in his eyes. The museum walls held pieces of history that felt almost sacred. People walked through the halls slowly, as if afraid to disturb the air. In the decades that followed, several documentaries were made about Takashi and the survivors. Writers published books and researchers collected interviews in many languages. His small, simple sentences became like hymns spoken in peace ceremonies. One of his most remembered lines said that the grass growing on burned earth does not know hatred, it only knows how to grow. That line became a guiding thought for many young people. They repeated it when they faced difficult times, using it as a reminder to choose growth over anger. 70 years after the bombings, the Peace Park in Hiroshima gathered thousands of people. Lanterns floated once again across the water, and cherry blossoms brushed softly against the night sky. An elderly woman who had once been a child, listening to Takashi, stood before the crowd. She said he always told them that healing would come when they could laugh without fear. She paused and looked at the peaceful city. Then she whispered that she believed they had reached that day at last. The city glowed with gentle lights, as if smiling back at her. It was a quiet evening filled with gratitude rather than sorrow. The memory of Hiroshima became a living part of Japan's identity. It taught people that the deepest strength grows from understanding rather than revenge. As the sun rose each morning, its light reflected off the river where the lanterns once drifted. The water shimmered, as though writing a message for anyone willing to look. The message was simple and clear. Every new dawn is a chance to choose peace. Generations walked through the memorial park with slow steps, carrying white flowers. They placed them beside the monuments and stood silently for moments of reflection. In that silence, there was an unseen connection. The living and the departed met not through words, but through the shared breath of remembrance. People understood that wars leave behind ruins, but also a kind of wisdom that arrives too late. Survivors like Takashi carried this wisdom in their stories and in their gentle way of speaking. Hiroshima became not a symbol of destruction, but a symbol of transformation. It showed the world that even a city once swallowed by fire could rise again with a heart full of compassion. Children visiting the dome called it the House of Light. To them, it was not a sign of doom, but a reminder of how strong the human spirit can be. This change in language became a quiet miracle. Words that were once heavy with grief grew into expressions of hope. In one peaceful summer evening, a young student sat by the river reading from Takashi's diary. He spoke softly the line that said to not look at the ash to be angry, but to look at the flower that grew above it. Tears filled his eyes, not out of pain but gratitude. He realized the story was not only about the past, but about every peaceful moment he lived today. The evening deepened into purple and lanterns glowed on the water. The river carried their light as though carrying blessings across time. People watched them drift and felt the quiet voice of the earth itself whispering. It said that although fire had once scorched this place, something gentle still glowed within it. The night in Hiroshima was unlike the night in any other city. It was a night that understood darkness and therefore knew how to be soft and calm. Stars glittered above the quiet streets and the scent of blooming trees filled the air. Nature seemed to tell humanity that healing was possible. Walking through the city at midnight, one could hear only the gentle flow of water. The reflections of lights on old walls shimmered like memories returning home. Sometimes an old man rested on a bench, half hidden in shadow. Sometimes the distant laughter of a child echoed through the quiet. These small sounds were the inheritance of Hiroshima. They were reminders that life had chosen to return and stay. The city had learned that everything can be rebuilt, even the human heart. Fire could destroy walls, but it could not destroy the idea of peace. In the final pages of his diary, Takashi had written that those who learn from the ashes do not fear fire again. The sentence carried the weight of a lifetime. The camera of a documentary once closed on the image of the river at night. Lanterns drifted softly, the city rested, and the sky above was perfectly still. The last sound was not a voice, but a gentle breath of the world. A breath that said the journey is complete and peace can rest here. The wind touched the water, carrying distant echoes of a painful past. Yet those echoes no longer hurt. They became warm memories guiding the present. Anyone closing their eyes in that moment could imagine the lanterns drifting slowly. Each lantern carried an unspoken wish or apology or a quiet love that had never been said. The message of Hiroshima became clear across nations. It was not to remember fire, but to protect the light that survives after fire fades. This story, like your long original text, was a journey into the heart of humanity. It showed the ability to begin again even after everything turns to ash. It revealed the mysterious strength that helps the human heart plant a flower where fire once fell. It showed that Japan did not defeat war with force, but with patience, music, and simple acts of kindness. If the world ever becomes too heavy and days grow dark, people can remember Hiroshima. They can remember that light can rise even from the center of an explosion. Human beings were made not to burn, but to shine. Every sunrise proves that hope survives. Take a slow breath and let the lanterns fade gently in your mind. Let the sound of the river calm your thoughts. Everything in the world grows quiet in the end. Even fear, even war, even the loud echoes of history. Everything returns to its natural place of stillness and peace. Everything becomes soft again, like a dream preparing to rest. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that somewhere in this world a city once made of ash now glows beneath the moon. And that glow is a promise that tomorrow will always come,